This one was different. She said it multiple times across multiple formats with the specific conviction of someone who has been wrong before and knows it and is determined that this time, the discernment is real. The red flags have been learned, the patterns have been recognized, the growth arc has been completed, and this finally is the result of it. A man who is different, who is real, who chose her clearly and without ambiguity, who came without the complications that plagued every previous chapter of her life. She was so sure, publicly, warmly, visibly sure in the way that Darcey is sure about things, which is all the way, immediately, with the full weight of her heart behind it. And then a woman, a real woman, with documents and photographs and a marriage certificate that was issued before Darcey ever learned this man's name, sat down with a journalist. And the interview she gave has now been published. And it begins with 11 words. He is my husband. He has been my husband for 4 years. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications because what we cover here, you will not find packaged this carefully anywhere else. Now let's get into it. Because this story does not get simpler the longer you look at it, it gets more layered, and every layer is worse than the last. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the scandal, but the beginning of the belief. Because to understand what happened here, you have to understand what Darcey was carrying into this relationship before it even started. You have to understand the weight of her history, the shape of what she was looking for, and exactly why this man was able to walk into that shape so perfectly and fill it so completely that she had no reason to look for the edges. Darcey Silva has been one of the most publicly documented heartbreak experiences in the history of reality television. That is not an exaggeration. From Jesse to Tom to Georgie, she has walked through relationships on camera that would have broken most people privately, let alone publicly. And she did not just survive them, she narrated them. She processed them out loud in front of millions with a level of emotional transparency that is genuinely rare and, depending on the moment, either devastating to watch or impossible not to root for. She has a gift for feeling things completely. That is real. It is also, as we are about to see, the specific quality that was identified and targeted. Because here's the thing about being someone who loves deeply and publicly and with full commitment. You are not just broadcasting your affection. You are broadcasting your needs. You are telling anyone watching exactly what you are looking for. The kind of presence that would feel like safety. The kind of certainty that would feel like healing. The kind of choosing that would feel like finally being chosen the way you have always deserved to be chosen. And most people watching that broadcast are watching it with compassion, but some people are watching it with something else entirely. Some people are watching it like a map. This man watched the map. He studied it. And then he showed up on her path looking exactly like the destination. The trap, and I want to use that word deliberately because what has since been documented does not allow for softer language. The trap was built from every specific thing this man said and did to establish his availability and his sincerity. Every declaration that communicated, "I am not with anyone." Every romantic gesture said, without words, "I am a free man making a free choice to be with this woman." Every moment, filmed or unfilmed, constructed the picture of someone who had arrived in her life without the legal complications, the hidden lives, the other women that had defined the painful chapters before. Each of those moments exists now against a specific backdrop. The backdrop is a marriage certificate. The certificate has a date on it. and that date is not close to when Darcey met this man. It is not a recent registration, not a technicality being resolved, not a separation pending paperwork. The date predates every single declaration of availability, every single "I chose you," every single moment that was supposed to be evidence that this time, finally, something was real. Think about what that means architecturally. The entire structure of this relationship, the origin story, the early conversations, the on-camera warmth, the declarations, was constructed by one person in the full knowledge that there was a legal obligation in another country that the other person did not know existed. He did not stumble into a deception. He did not allow a misunderstanding to persist out of cowardice or confusion. He built the deception from the foundation up. He engineered it deliberately, specifically, with full knowledge of what Darcey was looking for and full awareness that he was legally incapable of providing it. That distinction matters enormously. The difference between deception by omission and deception by architecture is not a small one. Omission is a failure of courage. Architecture is a failure of character. What the documents suggest and what the wife's interview has now placed into the public record is architecture. Now here is where the story becomes what I would call a double bind. And I want to walk through it carefully because this is the part that has the most moving pieces and the most potential to be misread. There are exactly two possible realities in a situation like this. The first reality, Darcey knew. Some element of the existing marriage was known to her, and the relationship was conducted with at least partial awareness of the legal situation. The second reality, Darcey did not know. The deception was total, the presentation was seamless, and she entered and sustained and publicly committed to this relationship with no information about the marriage in another country. Those are the only two options. The marriage certificate does not offer a third option. It exists or it does not, and it exists. Now watch what each option does. If she knew, even partially, even in a way she rationalized or minimized, her judgment is not just questioned, it is catastrophically compromised. Because she did not just privately believe in this man, she publicly used him as evidence of growth. She told the audience, essentially, "Look at who I am choosing now. Look at the discernment I have developed. Look at how different this is." If any of that was performed with knowledge of a competing legal commitment, the performance is not just embarrassing, it is a credibility-ending event. But here is the cruelty of the second option, which is the one that the available evidence strongly suggests is the true one. If she genuinely did not know if she was deceived completely and comprehensively by someone who understood her well enough to design the perfect presentation, then she is a victim, a real one. And the specific thing she is a victim of is not just betrayal. It is the weaponization of her own growth narrative. Someone took the language she used to describe becoming better at love, all the "I know what I want now" and "I recognize real connection now," and built a performance using that language as a script. He played the role she had described herself as ready for, and he did it while being legally married to someone else. If she didn't know, she wouldn't lose her credibility. But she loses the growth narrative, because the growth narrative said, "I am better at this now. I can recognize what is real." And then reality delivered a marriage certificate. There is no soft landing between these two options, and the wife who gave the interview is not interested in providing one. She provided documents. Let's talk about those documents. Because the interview did not function the way these interviews sometimes do, as emotional testimony without receipts, as one side of a story that can be dismissed as the grievance of a bitter ex. This interview came with evidence, and the evidence is layered in a way that makes the full picture very difficult to argue with. The first element the wife provided to the journalist: the marriage certificate. Not a copy she printed from an email, not a screenshot of something on a phone, an authenticated document with the date clearly visible, with both full names, with the issuing authority's official seal. The journalist confirmed its authenticity through independent channels before publishing. The date on that certificate is specific. It is not in the recent past. It is in the part of the past that predates, by a significant margin, any moment Darcey's name became connected to this man's. The second element: photographs. And here is why the photographs matter, beyond what photographs usually matter in situations like this. The wife did not only provide photographs from the ceremony, though those exist and are themselves significant. She provided photographs of subsequent shared life, a home, documented events attended together, shared existence across the years during which this man was allegedly single and available and emotionally unclaimed. Not one photograph, a documented record. A life in pictures that runs parallel to and directly contradicts the story he was telling in another country. And then there is the third element. This is the element that transformed this from a painful and complicated personal story into something the word active genuinely applies to. The wife provided WhatsApp message screenshots with metadata. The metadata includes timestamps. Those timestamps correspond to the period during which this man was publicly appearing with Darcey, expressing romantic commitment on camera and off, presenting himself as available and chosen and choosing. During that period, during the declarations, during the on-camera warmth, he was also messaging his wife. And the messages reference Darcey by name, in a context that makes the nature and the deliberateness of the deception impossible to describe as cultural ambiguity or emotional confusion or the complicated gray area that sometimes exists in international relationships. He knew. He knew during every single moment that it was supposed to be about Darcey and only Darcey. He knew, and he continued. That is what the metadata says. That is what is now in the published record. I want to take a moment here to talk about the production dimension of this, because this story does not only affect the people directly involved. It has implications that extend to the machinery around them, and those implications are being discussed in rooms that are not reality television editing bays. If this relationship was featured in any filmed content, any episode, any producer-facilitated introduction, any scene in which cameras were present while this man was presenting himself as single and available, then the production company that facilitated that content has questions to answer. And I want to be precise about what those questions are, because this is not about assigning blame for someone else's deliberate deception. This is about the process. A production company with the resources and infrastructure of TLC, producing content that regularly features international partners, has a due diligence responsibility. Basic background verification of someone appearing on camera in a romantic capacity should include, at minimum, a check of available civil registration records. Marriage registrations in many international jurisdictions, not all, but many, exist in searchable databases that are accessible to investigators with the right credentials and the budget to engage them. TLC has those credentials and that budget. If the marriage registration existed in a searchable database and was not found, the due diligence process failed. If it existed and was found and was not disclosed, the situation is meaningfully more serious than a process failure. And the wife who gave the interview is not only speaking to a journalist, she is, through that publication, speaking to an audience that includes people whose job it is to think about exactly this kind of liability. The conversation is happening, the details are being reviewed. That much is not speculation. It is the logical consequence of a published interview with authenticated documentation. Now I want to do something that I think is necessary here, and I want to do it carefully. I want to talk about Darcey's role and how this became possible. Not to assign blame, not to suggest she deserved what happened, not to do the thing where we find a way to make the victim responsible for the predator's choices. I am not doing that. What I want to examine is the specific mechanism by which this deception was sustainable, because understanding that mechanism is the only thing that makes this story useful rather than simply painful. Darcey has a documented pattern of rapid total investment. If you have watched even a handful of her appearances across the 90-Day franchise and the dedicated series, you have seen it. She moves from introduction to full emotional commitment at a speed that is genuinely unusual. It is not a character flaw in the simple sense. It comes from a real capacity for love, a real desire for connection, a genuine openness to the possibility that this could be it. Those are not bad qualities. In the right circumstances, they are beautiful ones. But here is what that speed creates in practical terms: a verification window that is very short. The verification window is the period between meeting someone and being fully committed to them, the period during which the rational mind is still weighing evidence, still open to information that contradicts the initial impression, still capable of slowing the emotional momentum if the data calls for it. Most people's verification windows in meaningful relationships span weeks or months. Darcey's windows, based on the documented record, are significantly shorter. A short verification window is not inherently dangerous, but it becomes dangerous when someone on the other side of the relationship understands that the window is short and uses that understanding strategically. If you know that someone moves quickly from hope to commitment and you want to sustain a deception, what you need to do is get through the window before it closes with your presentation intact. Get through the initial weeks without anything surfacing. Perform the role well enough and long enough that by the time any inconsistency might begin to emerge, the emotional commitment is already total and the filtering capacity is already compromised by investment. That is what appears to have happened here. The speed was not accidental to the deception. The speed was necessary for it. And knowing that it was a factor is not about criticizing Darcey. It is about understanding what a slower pace of early investment would have made possible. More time, more space, more opportunity for the inconsistencies in the story to surface before the heart was all the way in. That is the thing worth sitting with, not as judgment, as information. Here's something else I want to address directly because I think it matters for how we hold this story as an audience. There is a version of this content that treats what happened to Darcey as entertainment, as a twist in a long-running saga of bad choices and dramatic outcomes that makes for good watching. I am asking you to resist that version. Not because the story is not compelling, but because the thing at the center of it is not a plot development. It is about a human being who was deliberately deceived by someone who studied her and used what he learned to gain access to her life, her public platform, her emotional world, and presumably her resources, while being legally married to another woman on another continent. That is a specific kind of harm. It is targeted, it is premeditated, and it was carried out against someone who has already processed more public heartbreak than most people will experience privately in a lifetime. The compassion that is appropriate here is not the soft, pitying kind that keeps Darcey in a category of someone things happen to. It is the kind that recognizes genuine victimization and holds the person responsible for it fully accountable, which the wife, through her interview, has now begun to do through legitimate and documented means. The wife's decision to speak publicly matters, not just for Darcey, not just as a factual correction to a false narrative, but because the man at the center of this story appears to have built a life around a particular kind of approach, the identification of women who want to be loved completely, and the performance of complete love in a context where it is legally and practically impossible to deliver it. That approach works in silence. It depends on silence, on the wife staying quiet, on Darcey staying invested, on the performance continuing long enough to extract whatever it was designed to extract. The interview ended the silence. And ending the silence is the single most important thing that has happened in this story. We are coming to the midpoint of this breakdown, and before we go deeper into what happens next, what the realistic consequences are, what Darcey's path forward looks like, and what this means for every future relationship she discusses publicly, I want to leave you with the image that I cannot stop thinking about since this interview was published. There are two women in this story who did not make the central choice that created the situation. The wife did not choose to have her husband construct a parallel romantic life on camera in another country. Darcey did not choose to fall for someone who was legally committed to someone else. Both of them are now holding the consequences of a choice made by one person. A choice made with full awareness of what it would cost both of them when it was eventually discovered. And it was always going to be discovered. That is the thing about a marriage certificate. It does not disappear because you need it to. The wife has the documents. Darcey has the public record of her belief. And somewhere between those two realities is the full shape of what one person's deliberate deception can do, how far it reaches, how many people it touches, and how long after the original lie the damage continues to land. That is where we are at the midpoint. Sit with it. The first thing I want to address in this half of the breakdown is the emotional response question, because it is going to come up and I want to get ahead of the way it typically gets framed in situations like this. When a public figure has been deceived, the way the available evidence suggests Darcey was deceived, there is a predictable media cycle that follows the revelation. Phase 1 is shock and sympathy. The initial wave of, I cannot believe this happened to her. Phase 2 is the performance audit, the retrospective review of everything she said and did during the relationship, now filtered through the knowledge of the deception, searching for moments where something should have been caught. Phase 3 is the recovery narrative, the content, the interviews, the social media presence that signals healing, growth, and readiness for what comes next. That cycle is not inherently wrong, but it is worth naming because Darcey has been through versions of it before, and the speed at which she has historically moved through it particularly phase 3, is directly relevant to whether anything actually changes this time. Here is what I mean. Darcey has a remarkable capacity for emotional resilience that reads on camera and in content as inspiring. She bounces, she resets, she reframes, she finds the lesson and she states it, and she moves toward the next chapter with a visible energy that her audience has always responded to warmly. That energy is real. I am not questioning its authenticity, but there is a difference between emotional resilience and emotional processing. Resilience is the ability to keep moving after a blow. Processing is the slower, less filmable work of actually integrating what the blow revealed about the patterns that led to it. They can look identical from the outside. They are not the same thing. The risk in this specific situation, and I want to be precise about why this situation carries a higher risk than the previous chapters, is that the deception was so complete, so engineered, and so precisely targeted at Darcey's specific vulnerabilities that processing it requires sitting with a question that is genuinely uncomfortable. Not, why did I fall for someone bad again? That question is too general and too self-blaming to be useful. The useful question is more specific. Why was my verification window short enough that this became sustainable? Because the answer to that question is the actual lesson, not the lesson that gets posted, the lesson that gets lived. Let me talk about what genuine processing would look like in this case, not because I have any authority over Darcey's private life, but because I think it is worth making the distinction visible for the audience watching this, many of whom may recognize elements of this pattern in their own experience. Because this is not just a story about a television personality. This is a story about a specific kind of vulnerability that a specific kind of person knows how to find and exploit. And the audience for this channel is not immune to it. The verification window between meeting someone and being fully emotionally committed to them is not something most people consciously manage. We do not typically walk into a new relationship thinking, I am going to allocate 6 weeks to evidence gathering before I allow myself to feel anything. That is not how attraction works, and it is not how connection forms. But there is a version of early investment that maintains enough internal space to notice inconsistencies, enough room between the hope and the certainty to let information continue to arrive and be processed, rather than filtered through the lens of a commitment that has already been made. What collapses that space? A few things. The intensity of the other person's pursuit, the speed at which they move to establish closeness and exclusivity, and the language of deep connection. The match between their presentation and your pre-existing picture of what real love looks like. The relief of feeling chosen after a period of feeling unchosen. Any one of these things can compress the verification window. All three of them together, working simultaneously, can close it almost entirely. Now look at what the evidence in this story suggests about Darcey's experience of this relationship in its early stages. An intense pursuit from someone who spoke her language of love fluently and immediately. A presentation that matched her stated picture of what honest, clear, drama-free commitment looks like. And the specific relief of feeling, finally, genuinely chosen by someone who appeared to have no competing claims on his heart. 3 factors, simultaneously deployed, by someone who, the documented evidence strongly suggests, understood exactly what he was doing. That is not a pattern Darcey fell into. That is a pattern she was guided into by someone with a clear understanding of the destination. Now I want to talk about my wife, Because in the way this story is going to be discussed in the wider 90-day conversation in comment sections and fan forums and reaction videos, the wife risks being reduced to a plot device. The woman who showed up with the documents, the twist in the narrative. And that reduction is not acceptable, and I want to push back against it before it becomes the default frame. The wife in this situation made a decision that carries real cost. Going to a journalist, providing authenticated personal documents, allowing your marriage, your private, legal, and emotional reality to become the subject of public reporting is not a casual choice. It is not something you do for drama. It is something you do when you have exhausted the private options and concluded that the public record requires correction because the silence is enabling continued harm. That is a specific kind of courage. It does not always look like courage from the outside. Sometimes it looks like exposure, like airing something painful in a public arena, but the decision behind it is real, and it is not made lightly. She came with a marriage certificate. She came with photographs of a shared life. She came with WhatsApp screenshots that have metadata and timestamps and references to Darcey by name. She came prepared. That level of preparation is not the act of someone acting impulsively out of jealousy or a desire for attention. It is the act of someone who has been sitting on this information, watching a situation unfold publicly, making a decision about whether and how and when to speak, and ultimately concluding that speaking with evidence is the only version of speaking that will be believed and that will matter. She was right. It is being believed, and it is mattering in exactly the ways she presumably intended it to matter. There is a legal dimension to this story that deserves its own moment, and I want to walk through it without overstating what is known and what is speculation. What is known is this: a man presented himself as legally available to enter a romantic relationship while being, by the documentation provided and independently authenticated, legally married in another jurisdiction. What is known is that this presentation occurred in part on camera, in content that was produced and distributed by a major network. What is known is that the deception based on the WhatsApp metadata was active and known throughout the period it was occurring. What that creates, in legal terms, depends significantly on jurisdiction, on the specific nature of any contracts or agreements that were in place during the production of any filmed content, and on the specifics of what due diligence was and was not conducted by the production company. I am not a lawyer, and I am not going to speculate about specific legal outcomes, but I am going to say this. The wife did not publish an interview. A journalist published an interview. There is a difference. The journalist's organization has a legal team that reviewed the documentation before publication and made a determination that it was sufficient to proceed. That determination is itself a significant moment. It means someone with liability responsibility looked at the marriage certificate and the photographs and the WhatsApp screenshots and concluded, this is solid enough to put in print. That conclusion reaches further than the article. It reaches into conversations that are currently being had by people whose job titles include the word legal and whose calendars have been rearranged to accommodate those conversations. The ripple from this interview is still moving outward. We are watching it in real time. Let me bring this back to Darcey directly, because that is where the emotional center of this story lives, and I do not want the structural and legal analysis to obscure it. What is Darcey's actual position right now? Not her public position, not what she is or will be posting, not the statements that will be issued or the framing that will be applied to her response. Her actual position. She committed publicly. She said, in the way she says things, which is completely and visibly and with her whole self, that this was real and that she had done the work to know the difference and that the difference was clear to her. She did that in front of her audience, in front of the people who have been watching and rooting for her, and also at times watching and wincing on her behalf. She put the full weight of her growth narrative behind a man who was legally married to another woman. And now that is just true. It is in the record. The marriage certificate is in the record. The interview is on the record. The WhatsApp screenshots with her name in them are in the record. And the record does not renegotiate. What that means for Darcey is that the growth narrative, the ongoing public story of becoming someone who knows herself well enough to recognize real love, has to be rebuilt. Not from scratch. She has not lost everything she has genuinely learned and genuinely become through the painful process of very public heartbreak. But the specific chapter that said, "And now I am ready and I can see clearly," has been closed by external events. And the new chapter has to begin with an honest accounting of what happened, including the uncomfortable parts, including the verification window, including the speed, including the specific ways in which this man's presentation was designed to get through her defenses, and what a more sustained defensiveness might have surfaced before the commitment was total. That accounting is not content. I want to say that clearly and directly. It is not a reel. It is not an interview on a couch somewhere with a sympathetic host. It is private, unglamorous, probably difficult work that does not produce anything shareable. It produces something better than shareable. It produces an actual change in the pattern. And an actual change in the pattern is the only thing that makes this story anything other than the latest installment in a series that has been running for too long with the same ending. Here is what I want to say to the people watching this who are in Darcey's corner. And I know you are here because this channel has always attracted people who watch with their whole hearts, the way Darcey loves with her whole heart. Being in her corner right now does not mean defending the indefensible. It does not mean explaining away the growth narrative or pretending the marriage certificate is ambiguous when it is not. It does not mean rushing her through the grief of this so that she arrives at the inspiring comeback content faster. Being in her corner right now means holding space for the possibility that this time, finally, the consequence is severe enough and public enough and documented enough that the actual work gets done. Not the performed work, the actual work. The kind that does not produce content for 6 months while it is happening. The kind that looks from the outside like stillness, and that is, on the inside, the most active and important thing she has ever done. That is what someone in her corner is rooting for. Not the next relationship, the pause before it. The long, serious, private pause before it. The pause in which the verification window gets examined and widened and protected with the full weight of everything this experience has just cost her. Let me talk about what comes next in terms of the public story, because the mechanics of how this narrative evolves are worth understanding if you want to follow it intelligently rather than reactively. The first wave of coverage has already broken. The interview has been published. The documents are in the record. The initial cycle of reaction from fans, from other content creators, from the broader 90-day community is in motion. That cycle will run for approximately 2 to 3 weeks before the next development either accelerates or redirects it. What are the possible next developments? The man at the center of this responds publicly. This is the highest impact potential development and also the highest risk one, because any public response he offers is now being evaluated against a documented record that is not in his favor, and the bar for a credible denial has been set by authenticated documents, not by his word against hers. A denial without equivalent documentation does not compete with a marriage certificate and WhatsApp metadata. So if he responds, what he says matters less than what he can prove. And what he can prove, given the state of the published record, appears to be very limited. The second possible development, Darcey responds. This response will be watched with extraordinary attention, not for its emotional content, though the emotional content will be noted, but for its relationship to the documented record. Does the response acknowledge the full scope of what has been revealed, or does it reach for a softer framing that leaves room for ambiguity the documents do not actually leave? Does it come quickly, as her responses to previous relationship crises have tended to come? Or does it come after a pause that suggests the private work is actually happening? The timing and the substance of her response will tell us more about which version of the story we are in than almost anything else that could happen. The third possible development, production acknowledges the situation in some form. This is the least likely of the three in the short term, because institutional responses to this kind of exposure move slowly and through lawyers. But it is the most consequential in the long term, because what TLC says or does not say about its due diligence process will shape how future international partners are vetted, or will confirm that no meaningful change in that process is coming. Either outcome is significant. Both are worth watching. I want to close this breakdown by doing something I do not always do at the end of these videos, which is speaking directly to the emotional core of the situation rather than the analytical one. Because I have spent a lot of this breakdown in the analytical frame, the mechanisms of the deception, the legal implications, the structural vulnerabilities, the production accountability. And all of that is important, and all of it is real. But underneath all of it is something simpler and more human. A woman went looking for someone who would choose her completely. She has been looking for that for a long time, in front of a very large audience, with a level of openness and vulnerability that most people would never sustain under much smaller amounts of public pressure. She found someone who performed complete choosing with extraordinary precision while being legally committed to someone else in another country. She was deceived not because she was foolish, but because she was open, and her openness was specifically, deliberately targeted by someone who understood it well enough to weaponize it. That is a real harm. It belongs in the category of real harm. And it deserves to be held as such, not as content, not as a twist in a long-running entertainment narrative, but as something that happened to a real person who was trying, genuinely and publicly, to build something real. The wife who gave the interview made sure it could not be covered up or quietly resolved. She did Darcey a service in that, even if the service is painful to receive. The truth of the situation, documented, authenticated, published, is now available to Darcey in a form that cannot be rationalized away or reframed into something more comfortable. That is a gift, even when it does not feel like one, especially when it does not feel like one. The wife gave the interview. The certificate is in the record. The metadata is in the record. The man's name and his documented marital status are permanently attached to this chapter of Darcey's story. That is the point of no return, not for her reputation, which has survived things that would have finished most public figures, but for the specific version of the growth narrative that said, "I can see clearly now." That version is over. What replaces it depends entirely on what happens next, not in the content, not in the posts, not in the next relationship that gets introduced to the audience. What happens next in private work, the real work? The slow, unfilmable, unglamorous work of understanding why the verification window was short enough that this became possible, and building something inside herself that makes it less possible the next time. Not impossible. Nothing is impossible. And love requires a degree of vulnerability that can never be fully armored, but less possible, harder to engineer, harder to sustain without detection. That work is the most important thing she can do right now. More important than any response. More important than any reframe. More important than whatever comes next in front of a camera. We are rooting for her to do it, genuinely, without irony, without the entertainment frame. Rooting for her. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, if it changed the way you were looking at this story, or reminded you of something in your own life about verification windows and the speed of investment and the specific kind of person who knows how to use your openness against you, then do something with that. Like this video so that more people find it, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss what comes next, because this story is not finished. And when the next development breaks, we will be here with the full context and the careful analysis that it deserves. Share this with someone who watches Darcey and Stacey and who will understand why this particular chapter matters more than the others. The tell-all tapes exists because these stories deserve more than reaction. They deserve examination. They deserve the kind of attention that turns entertainment into something that actually teaches you something about people, about the people on screen, and about yourself. We will see you in the next one. Stay careful out there. And stay open, just not so open that the verification window disappears entirely. That balance is the whole game. Darcey is learning it in public. The least we can do is learn it alongside her.